Okay, people are still coming into the webinar and also watching on our YouTube, but I'm going to start this latest episode, latest edition of our weekly Zoom series. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center in Jerusalem. And every week I speak to political figures, academics, journalists about issues that are happening, contemporary issues that are happening here in Israel, the Jewish world, or historical events that still impact us today and are of interest to those of us who follow what's going on here in the Middle East or in the wider Jewish world. As always, we have attendees from Israel and around the world. Those of you like me in Israel are very aware that we are in the middle of sort of week of national remembrance, national memorial, with Yom HaShoah last week. This week we'll be commemorating Israel's fallen soldiers tomorrow evening, and then the following day transitioning into the celebrations of Yom HaAtzmaut. And with that in mind, with the celebrations of Israel's independence in mind and thinking about Israel's independence, I really wanted to shine a spotlight on a new book that's been written about the years immediately prior to Israel's establishment, and specifically the constellation of great powers that were instrumental in either supporting or attempting to block the establishment of the State of Israel. And what makes this book so fascinating, as we'll hear, is that in so many respects, the identity of the countries and their positions is not what you would expect, is in many cases the opposite of what we now think of as the international alliance of Israel friends versus Israel skeptics or enemies. And I'm really delighted to have with me, virtually at least, the writer of this book, Israel's Moment. That writer is Professor Jeffrey Herf, distinguished professor of modern history at the University of Maryland, who studies the intersection of ideas and politics in modern European history, specializing in 20th century Germany. He's published extensively on Germany during the Weimar years, Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, and West and East Germany during the Cold War. He's written a number of books. Prior to this one, he's written, including Undeclared Wars with Israel, East Germany and the West German far left, Nazi propaganda for the Arab world, the Jewish enemy, Nazi propaganda during World War II and the Holocaust, and Divided Memory, the Nazi past in the two Germanys. I'm going to talk with Professor Herf for about 30-40 minutes and then ask you to please submit your questions to him. Please write them into the Q&A facility, the Q&A little button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I will put those questions to him, and we will hear what he has to say. Professor Jeffrey Herf, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Great. So as I've just said, and perhaps some of those on the call that know of your work might also be asking this question. You're an acclaimed historian, award-winning historian of the 20th century, but your previous work has focused on Germany, particularly during the Nazi period, but also the years before that and immediately after that. So what made you decide to write this book, which on the face of it is about Israel, or more precisely, pre-state Israel?
When I was working on several of my books about German history deal with the aftermath of Nazism. Divided Memory deals with the German tradition of confronting the Nazi past. And the mix of denial and avoidance and confrontation is well known to listeners and viewers on this Zoom call, I'm sure. But one of the best aspects of it was articulated by the German returned refugee social theorist Theodor Adorno, who said that the categorical imperative of German thinking after the Holocaust must be to do everything possible to see that it doesn't happen again. And when I worked on my histories of Nazi propaganda, both in Germany and then aimed at North Africa and the Middle East, I realized that the history of Nazism ended as a major political phenomenon in 1945 in Europe, as a major political phenomenon, but that there was an afterlife of Nazism in the Middle East. And I became more and more interested in the history of the collaboration between some of the leaders of the Palestinian Arabs and the Nazi regime during World War II. And that is most famously associated with Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. And the German historians have devoted some effort to that. And I wanted to find out more about the extent to which the after effects of Nazism had something to do with the Arab decision to reject the United Nations partition plan in 1947 and go to war instead. So that was the so that there is a clear connection between my work in German history and my interest in Israel and the Middle East. Second, I was, as a member of the American Historical Association, I took a public position in against resolutions to boycott and sanction the state of Israel. And in the course of those debates, I heard many people repeat things about Israel that I was pretty sure were not true, but I said, what can I do constructively to deal with this massive accusations? And I thought the best thing I can do would be to work as a historian, to see what actually happened in 1947-48, who supported and who opposed the establishment of the Jewish state. What did terms like imperialism and anti-imperialism, racism and anti-racism, what did they mean back then? So that's why I decided to do it.
Fantastic, and of course, the great sort of for many of us at least in reading your book, I think the great chidush, as they say here in Israel, the great new idea or sort of thing that strikes you immediately is what it reveals about the world as we think of it in terms of attitudes of particular countries to Israel is kind of turned on its head. So the most fervent and unequivocal support for the establishment of a Jewish state comes from the Soviet Union, which before long will be the ringleader of the forces of international anti-Zionism. And the United States is very much split on the question of support for Israel. So if we can take that second one first, actually, the United States. Now, I knew that the State Department disagreed with Truman's support for Israel's establishment. I don't think I was aware until I became aware of the findings of your book, the extent of that opposition. I mean, to the point where, am I right in saying they even tried to undermine the 1947 UN partition plan?
Yes. The book begins with the mobilization in support of the Zionist project in the United States on the part of course, Zionists and Jews, but also prominent liberal and left liberal, even left-wing journalists and liberal politicians. The empathy for Jewish refugees in displaced persons camps in Germany and Austria in 1945-46 becomes a public issue in the United States. But the momentum in 1945, 46, 47 in favor of the Zionist project is growing in American public opinion. And what then happens, beginning in the summer of 1947, is that Secretary of State George Marshall, former General George Marshall, the director of the policy planning staff, George Kennan, famous for his arguments regarding the containment of communism, begin to make the case that the interests of the United States in the Middle East are synonymous with the preservation of British power in the region.
Hmm.
And that in order to contain the Soviet Union and to retain access to Arab oil, the United States must see to it that Britain remains a power. And the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine contradicts that policy. So in the fall of 1947, the British and American officials meet at the Pentagon in Washington in something called the Pentagon Talks, which, I'm making a long story short, argue that the meaning of containment of the Soviet Union and of international communism in the Middle East must be to retain British position as, quote, the cornerstone of our policy, in Marshall's phrase, and that in the British Foreign Office, in the British military, in the Pentagon, in the State Department, the Zionist movement and was seen as suspiciously associated with the Soviet Union and communism. So the argument against communism and against the Soviet Union cut against the Zionist project. And that becomes a consensus within the State Department in the fall of 1947. President Truman is unique because he is the only Cold Warrior and anti-communist in his administration who also is sympathetic to the Zionist project. So the United States does support the partition resolution because the president insists that it does, but immediately the State Department began to make the case that the partition resolution had been a bad idea, and that if it had to be enforced with the force of arms, that would antagonize the Arabs, and that would endanger access to oil, and oil was crucial for the economic recovery of Western Europe. So in every way, and George Kennan made the case that the United States should turn against the partition resolution, and that the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine was not in the national security interests of the United States. And wow. that becomes a consensus by January and February of 48, at which point in March, the State Department attempts to reverse the partition plan in the United Nations. It fails. But in November of 47, Loy Henderson, who was the head of the Division on Africa and the Middle East in the State Department, proposed that the United States support an embargo on arms to the Middle East. And that arms embargo is adopted in December of 47, and then it becomes a United Nations arms embargo. And that arms embargo disproportionately disadvantaged the pre-state Jews in British Mandate Palestine. And while President Truman recognized the new state in May, he never overturned the arms embargo. And that was consequential because just as Volodymyr Zelensky said after President Biden offered him a ride out of Kiev, he said, I don't need a ride, I need weapons. And David Ben-Gurion was in the same situation. Right. And the weapons came from Czechoslovakia, when the Jews needed them the most. So in every way, it appeared to the State Department and the Pentagon and the British Foreign Office that the weapons were coming from Czechoslovakia. Andrei Gromyko was arguing in support of the Zionists in the UN. There must be some connection between the Zionists and the communists. And that old association, or not so old then, between Jews and communism was being revived in the post-war years regarding Zionism and communism. So the Zionist project was associated with the passions of anti-fascism and World War II, but the early months and years of the Cold War cut against support for the Zionist project in the United States and Britain.
So the fact that the anti-fascist fight had so quickly been sort of superseded by the anti-communist fight, at least in the eyes of the leaders of the United States and Britain, that disadvantaged the Jews. That disadvantaged the Jewish cause in many ways.
The British Foreign Office and American intelligence officials in Europe kept very, very close tab on the Mossad. The Mossad referred to its operations. It referred to a quote clandestine plan of immigration. There was very little that the Western intelligence agencies were very well informed about exactly what was going on, and so nobody was being fooled. These were desperate people who wanted to stay alive, and but the State Department and British files are filled with reports about the Soviet Union sending KGB agents or NKVD agents in the refugee stream, so that the refugee stream was some kind of clever plot by the Soviet Union to spread communism in Palestine. And the reports, rather than one intelligence official even says, many of the refugees that we're seeing tell us the same story. They say that because they were Jewish, they were in a concentration camp. And now, in order to save their lives because of post-war anti-Semitism, they want to get to Palestine. They all seem to be telling the same story, as if this is some kind of clever Secret Service operation. And so that is yes. I mean, the question of communism and anti-communism operates against the Zionist the Zionist project in Washington and London.
But is it also assisted by the fact that the mainstream Zionist movement was headed by a socialist movement?
Well, that's a very interesting and important question, because the Central Intelligence Agency, in its operations in Italy and France and West Germany in the late 40s and early 50s, was doing everything it could to support democratic socialists in Europe. The argument was that if the opposition to the Soviet Union was fundamentally or primarily Catholic and conservative, then the NATO alliance would collapse.
Yeah.
And given that the continent had moved to the left in the aftermath of the Second World War, it was crucial that the United States have allies who were left of center, but also Democrats.
Democrats.
David Ben-Gurion fit the bill.
Right.
Yes. The Zionists were exactly that. Left of center, democratic socialists.
Right.
But the argument in Washington was never made that the Zionists are like the German Social Democrats, the West, or the Italian Socialists, or the French Socialists,
or the British Labour Party,
or the British Labour Party. Right. It's to read the files is to be quite struck with how little the Holocaust resonated in the halls of power in those immediate post-war years.
Right, and we just mentioned I just mentioned the British Labour Party. Of course, in Britain at that time, the Labour Party is in power, comes to power in 1945. The government of Clement Attlee, and from initially, I think in the early 40s, as part of the Churchill-led wartime coalition government, the Labour Party was often sort of part of a broadly pro-Zionist position. By the time it gets to government, and Attlee's prime minister, and crucially Ernest Bevin is foreign secretary, it's a different story, right? We're talking about Bevin in particular as this sort of colossus of Western Western anti-communism.
Yes.
Who is also very much against Zionism.
One of the things that's important to remember about the establishment of the State of Israel is that while it has been the subject of trillions of words of reporting and commentary, in 1947-48, it was most decidedly a sideshow. The main event was in Europe, and the main event was what to do about the Red Army and the Soviet Union and how to contain it, and that was the focus of Bevin and Marshall and Truman. And Bevin was his anti-communism was emphatic, and for him, again, basically he adopted the view of the British Foreign Office during the Second World War. That is while they were giving up the empire in India, they wanted to hold on to it in the Middle East.
Right.
So the clash between Britain and the Zionists was direct. As I said just a moment ago, the State Department took the view that the cornerstone of American policy in the Middle East should be supporting the British position in the region. That was incompatible with the establishment of a Jewish state.
Well, and you mentioned in passing Andrei Gromyko, the Soviet ambassador to the United Nations. Yeah. He was fervently supporting Zionism in the UN, right?
Well, in May of 1947, Gromyko gave a speech in the General Assembly or Security Council, I'm not sure which, in which he said that the Soviet Union would prefer a binational state of Jews and Arabs in former Mandate Palestine. But if the Jews and the Arabs cannot get along or do not agree to that, then the Soviet Union would support the creation of an Arab state in Palestine and a Jewish state, a two-state solution. And this was a bit of a stunt. This stunned the United Nations, but from that moment until May of 1949, the Soviet Union was emphatic in support of a two-state solution, and there were two reasons. One were crass power politics on Stalin's part. That is, he hoped that the new Jewish state would be a kind of a lever for pushing Britain out of the Middle East. So there's no point in romanticizing anything associated with Stalin's decision-making. But Gromyko was also in a tradition that went back to Maxim Litvinov and Ivan Maisky, and these people were deeply influenced by the Holocaust and the Second World War. So for them, anti-fascism meant opposition to Nazism, but they're fighting the war against the Nazis. The Arab Higher Committee leadership had collaborated with the Nazis during the war, and the Zionists had fought with the Allies against the Nazis, and the Holocaust had happened. So from their perspective, anti-fascism meant support for the Zionist project. It was and whether it was American liberals or the Soviet Union, the Zionist project's strongest supporters from 1945 to 49 were liberals and leftists in the West and the Soviet bloc, not the quote imperialists, as it were, quote unquote, in the State Department and the Foreign Office.
Right. So we have this. So as well as having this this kind of topsy-turvy situation from our contemporary perspective of the Soviet Union being the main cheerleader, we also have American leftists and liberals being very much against the State Department line, supporting Zionism. Can you mention a few names, some important American figures in this campaign?
Yeah, there are many political figures in Washington involved, but two that I decided to focus on, well, actually three. Congressman Emanuel Seller, Democrat from Brooklyn, Senator Robert F. Wagner, the senator from New York. Both of them were major figures in supporting Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. And Sumner Welles, a former Undersecretary of State in the Roosevelt administration. And Seller and Wagner were pushing in 1945 and 1946 to bring Hashim al-Husseini to trial for war crimes. And journalists such as Frida Kirchway, the editor of the left liberal magazine The Nation, I.F. Stone, a very subsequently very well-known left liberal journalist, a left liberal newspaper called PM, here launched a campaign to bring Husseini to trial. And the argument was that the the shift from World War II to the Cold War was leading to amnesia and forgetting about those who had collaborated with the Nazi regime. Too many Nazis were going unpunished, and Hashim al-Husseini should be one of those people who, while not a decision maker in the Holocaust, had certainly fanned the flames of anti-Jewish hatred during the war on the radio and in Europe, and he should be brought to trial and indicted. And the argument was that if there was an indictment of Husseini and a trial in 1945, 46, 47, that his political career would have been ruined or damaged, and it would have been more difficult for him to come to prominence after the war. And the whole history of the collaboration of Husseini and other leaders of the Arab Higher Committee with the Nazis would have then come to a broader public. And that might have made it more possible for those Arab leaders who wanted a compromise solution to come to the fore. So one of the themes of the book is how unfortunate it was that this trial never took place. It is one of the because I think had it taken place, an enormous amount of evidence in the files of the British and the United States government, and who knows what other governments would have come to the fore. Unfortunately, a man who enthusiastically collaborated with the Nazi regime emerged as the leader of the Palestine Arabs in 1946, 47. And you asked initially about why, as a German historian, I became interested. And here I return to that theme, that Nazism had an afterlife after 1945. Husseini did not need the Nazis to hate the Jews. That was an indigenous product on his part. His own very radical interpretation of the religion of Islam, interpreted as an inherently anti-Jewish religion. So Hamas is very much an after effect of his views, expressed in the Muslim Brotherhood and that kind of thing. So again, this shift from World War II to the Cold War, the short-term amnesia, the absence of reckoning, that's a major theme, a major theme of post-war European history. Tony Judd and others, I've written about it. That's relevant as well for the case of Hashim al-Husseini.
And one country that we haven't mentioned yet, the sort of third in the triumvirate of Western powers, France. They also, I think, from what I understand from your book, played a much greater role in this whole story than is often thought about, including, I think, in the Hashim al-Husseini saga, right?
Yes. This was the first time that I had worked in the French archives, and so it was a great. Though, if there are historians here on the call, if you've not worked in the Foreign Ministry archives in La Courneuve outside Paris, or the government files in Pierrefitte, I highly recommend it. Hopefully they're open in a post-COVID world. They're fantastic archives. In May of 45, the French military arrested Husseini in Germany and then brought him back to Paris, where he was under house arrest administered by the Foreign Ministry from May of 45 to June of 46. And the archives in La Courneuve contain the files of fascinating conversations that Husseini had with French officials about his activities during the Nazi period. And you can see the Foreign Ministry coming to the conclusion that leniency towards Husseini would have the benefit of fostering goodwill in the Arab states towards France. And so that, therefore, the Foreign Ministry rejected appeals coming from New York and from Wagner and Seller and Kirchway and others to bring him to trial. They rejected those appeals, and they rejected the suggestions of the British government to take him out of France and put him on an island someplace where he wouldn't be able to go back to Palestine. However fanciful that would have, probably would have stayed there about a week or so, but who knows? At any rate, the the French government saw the benefits of lenient treatment for Husseini. It was very mild oversight, and he, quote, escaped in June of 46 and returned to the Middle East to a hero's welcome. And he was very grateful to the French government, the French foreign ministry. The French government was a coalition government, and the Ministry of the Interior was directed by socialists, Jules Moch and Edward Depreux, and the socialists were working closely, if behind the scenes, not publicly, with the Mossad in facilitating Jewish emigration from the port of Marseille and other ports in southern France. There's also, I didn't go into the Italian story, but I would imagine, my guess is that the Italian socialists and communists were also facilitating immigration from Italian ports, but others can work on that. So the French government was split, and the socialists, even communists, Gaullist veterans of the resistance, were pro-Zionist. They weren't sending weapons, but they did send people. And they did undermine the British blockade. These years are important because when the Soviet Union turned against Israel in 1940, in fall of 49, from then until 1967, Israel had one really consequential ally in this world, and that was France, not the United States. The United States was not hostile, but it kept its distance. But the weapons, the Mirage jets of 1967 war and the nuclear program, they came from France. And the origins of that alliance, that de facto alliance, lie in the post-war years that Israel's moment examines.
I mean, at some point that changes, right? Because de Gaulle, I know, becomes very hostile to Israel.
Absolutely.
Especially in the wake of Algeria and the perceived need to keep the Arabs on side, right?
Well, de Gaulle's turn in 1967 is continuous with the policies of the foreign ministry. The policy of the foreign ministry, French foreign ministry, from 1945 to 49. So the Catholic Church, too, in France, very influential, was not happy about the establishment of the Jewish state. It's the French, I mean, the France always had strong interests in North Africa and in Syria and Lebanon, and they too. Of course, there were the people in the Interior Ministry were arguing in the same way that Emmanuel Seller and Robert Wagner were, or Kirchway and Stone, that the new Jewish state would be a democracy and would be an ally and an asset to the West. But de Gaulle, obviously, there's an element of returning to some traditional French foreign policy views in his 1967 decisions.
Right. I want to urge our audience to keep getting questions into the Q&A. We've already had a couple. I want to get some more in as well.
I'd like to say one thing
Sure.
about the question of racism,
yeah.
which I haven't mentioned before, and then I'd be glad to. I really would like to hear questions.
Yeah.
One of the most successful elements of Soviet and PLO propaganda that is expressed in the BDS movements of recent years is that Zionism is a form of racism or apartheid. And not only is that false, but it's succeeded in diverting attention from the views of the founding fathers of the nationalism of the Palestine Arabs. Jamal Husseini was Haj Amin al-Husseini's cousin, and he was the representative of the Arab Higher Committee at the United Nations. And in January of 1947, and then in September of 1947, in January in London and September in New York at the UN, he gave a long speech about why he opposed the establishment of the Jewish state. And in that speech, he said the following: The Arab world is a territorial continuity inhabited by a homogeneous population with one national outlook. As such, it is free from the serious frictions and a natural bulwark for peace. Homogeneity in race, he said, homogeneity in race has always been the natural basis for mutual understanding and community of interests. The creation of an alien Jewish state in Palestine means the destruction of this territorial continuity and national homogeneity. That's Jamal Husseini in 1947. And so I hope that when people read the book, it will encourage a discussion about the relationship between racism and the nationalism of the Palestine Arabs, which they have very successfully avoided for 70 years.
Right. And as you say, have also, with the help of the Soviet Union, successfully propagandized this complete reversal of the reality.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get to some questions that we've received from our
I'll give shorter answers.
Yeah, that's fine. So there's a question from Paul Lips who says, when does the State Department change its attitude to Israel? 1967? He's asking nicely.
After 1967, not before 1967. Things changed under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, and they warmed up some. But the big change came in the aftermath of Israel's victory in the Six-Day War, when first President Johnson and then President Nixon, Nixon-Kissinger team, concluded that it was obvious that Israel was now an asset to the West, and so the change came very late.
An asset in the sense of it being like a sort of military bulwark against the Soviet allies and the Soviet Arab allies.
Yes, I mean the Six-Day War demonstrated that it was a huge humiliation for the Soviet Union, and at the time the United States was in the quagmire in Vietnam.
Okay, great, thank you. Question here from Shmur Yerushalmi, who says he wants to ask, is it true that that one of the reasons for the Soviet support for the establishment of Israel was wishing for the new Jewish country to be part of an anti-imperialist camp?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. That was that was one of the calculations, and the Soviet Union had the same assessment as the British intelligence services, which was the Arabs were traditionally conservative and profoundly religious, and therefore deeply anti-communist, whereas the Jews came from modern Europe. They emerged. They were familiar with socialism and communism, and that the Jews were thus more likely to be sympathetic to the Soviet Union. And the Red Army had played such a major role in the defeat of Nazi Germany. So all these things would suggest that perhaps this new state would be sympathetic to the Soviet Union. In the first elections in late 1940, I believe in 1949, the Israeli Communist Party got less than 5% of the vote. I don't have the exact percentage at my fingertips, but and at that point, Stalin understood that his bet on the Zionist option had not turned out as he wished, and that this was not going to be a bastion or a Trojan horse for the Soviet Union, and he was, and then famously, of course, Golda Meir visited Moscow and was greeted with great enthusiasm, and so that troubled him as well. And there was his own anti-Semitism, I think, as well. Pardon?
His own anti-Semitism.
Yes, his own anti-Semitism. Yes. And his calculation was that the Arabs had the oil, and if you could take the oil away from Western Europe, then that would be that would serve Soviet strategy in Europe as well. So that Ben-Gurion understood that, and one of the things that I come away from that I concluded from writing the book is the greatness of Ben-Gurion. Really, he emerges to me as one of the great political figures of global international history in the 20th century. because he understood that there was this window of opportunity, a very brief window of opportunity, in which both the Soviet Union and the President of the United States would support the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. But that window could close at any moment. And if it did close, and if Stalin changed his mind, then the Jews would be up against most of the United Nations. And it would be very, very hard. And there would be no weapons from Czechoslovakia. So Ben-Gurion said, we need to do it now. We can't wait. We have to declare the state May 14th. So in thinking about this week's celebrations or commemorations, I think maybe it seems like such an obvious thing to say in Tel Aviv, perhaps, but Ben-Gurion and Moshe Sharett really are, I think, towering figures for Sharett's diplomatic brilliance is very, it just comes through in the book, at least to me, and Ben-Gurion's decisiveness is Churchillian. I mean, it's
right.
He to my view, it's a little state. You know, he doesn't have the United States of America. He doesn't have the Great Britain, and he's not like Churchill and Roosevelt. But in terms of his political insight and his courage, he is of that stature, I think.
Fascinating. So when you think about, maybe this is a silly question in a way, but given that the United States didn't help Israel in the war, it wasn't, as you said, it sort of stood to one side. Truman recognized the Declaration of Independence, but stood to one side. How much of a difference would it have made in practice if the US, let's say there'd been a different president, let's say Roosevelt was still alive, right? Or someone else who'd basically gone along with the State Department line and not recognized the state of Israel? How much of a difference would that have made?
Well, politically, I think it would have made a big difference.
Right.
I think that when the United Nations was founded, it was the topic of a subject of great admiration and hope around the world. So what the United Nations supported mattered. And when Israel had the support of the United Nations, it meant a great deal. If the United States had not supported the partition resolution in the fall of 47,
right,
then I don't see how the state could have come about. I think that would have been extremely difficult.
Right. And that was Truman. That was Truman.
Yeah. Truman, I think, did as much as he was up against the entire national security establishment. Right. He had supporters on Capitol Hill and in the Congress and public opinion, but his advisors were telling him, Mr. President, what you're doing is undermining the national security interests of the United States.
Right.
Other people were telling him differently, but an anecdote toward the end of the book maybe captures a bit of this. James McDonald was the first ambassador to the State of Israel from the United States and had been very sympathetic to the Zionists. He met with Ben-Gurion and Sharett in May of 49, and the State Department was unhappy with Ben-Gurion's refusal to accept the return of the refugees. And Ben-Gurion said, well, they can come back if there's a peace treaty, but they won't sign a peace treaty. They won't talk to us. So no, they're not going to come back if they're still at war with us. This is crazy. We're not going to commit suicide. And then the conversation goes on, and the tone of the letter is, after all that we've done for you, the United States, now we're going to reconsider our relationship with Israel. Yeah? So Ben-Gurion says, well, and I'm paraphrasing now, you tried to overturn the partition resolution. Then you imposed an arms embargo on us. And then he says to McDonald, who is his friend, he says, if we had to depend on you, the United States, we would have been exterminated.
Wow.
So he admired Truman greatly. They appreciated what he had done. But there is a certain romance about the American relationship with Israel in the early years that that obscures some of the realities.
Hmm. There's a couple of questions about France that I want to put to you. Maybe I'll put them both to you at the same time.
Okay.
Sheldon Lerman says that you mentioned that France didn't supply arms to the Jews in the pre-state period, but didn't France facilitate the arms ship, the Irgun arms ship, the Alta Lena?
Absolutely. Yes. 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 But that was a one-off thing.
Okay.
And it was and it was well, as the questioner knows very well, it led to this battle on the beach, and the ship being the Haganah sunk the ship and all that. So it was the story of the Altalena is I don't go into the Altalena story because I don't think it was a significant one in regarding the military supply of the main military force of the Jews in Palestine. But it does draw attention to the fact that that Begin, we're now at the Begin Center, that there were supporters of the Irgun in France. Probably one of the most interesting is the writer Jean-Paul Sartre, who wrote an article in Riposte, the Paris newspaper of the Irgun, calling for arms for the Hebrews. So yes, the questioner is certainly right about the Altalena, but a kind of regular flow of weapons that was what the Jews needed. That was coming from the Czechs.
Right. Thank you. And the other French question from Ben Paschkov, who says, according to his own biography, to the biographies of Shimon Peres, he was influential in building the initial cooperation between France and Israel. Is that something that your research bears
I didn't deal with the 50s and with Peres' work on the nuclear program.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, he was in the middle of all of that.
Right.
But the point that I'm making is that the decision in France to do that was a product of the legacies of the French resistance during the war, of French socialists, of French leftists, Gaullist resistors, who saw the establishment of the Jewish state as a continuation of the principles and values for which they had fought during World War II. One can say they were right or wrong, or in retrospect, differently, whatever. But that's how they saw things then.
So there's a question from Shmuel Yerushalmi, who says, in your opinion, why do you think the majority of the fact that the majority of the Muslim world were opposed to the establishment of Israel, is that down to anti-Semitism in the Hajj Amin al-Husseini sense, or sort of caring about the interests of the Palestinian Arabs, or just narrow political interests?
Well, that's a large question. I don't know what most of the Muslim world thought. What I know and what historians have worked on are the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood was crucial for the Arab Higher Committee and for the impetus to reject the partition resolution and go to war. So I wouldn't make generalizations. Let me put it this way. I'm sure there are many listeners on the call who have read the Torah, obviously read the Torah, but also read the New Testament and the Quran. And so we're adults on this call. All right? And we all know as adults that you can read these holy scriptures in different ways. And you can find things in them that are quite objectionable. And it's possible to read the Quran the way that Osama bin Laden read it, or the way that Hajj Amin al-Husseini, or Hassan al-Banna, or the leaders of Hamas. The quotes are there. You can select and pick out from the Quran the quotes that are very nasty about the Jews. And you can read it in a different way. But the people who read it in this kind of anti-Semitic direction were in the Muslim Brotherhood and in the Arab Higher Committee, interpreted the religion of Islam as an anti-Jewish theology. The Nazis were delighted to discover that, by the way. David Motadl at the University of London has written a fine book called Islam and Nazi Germany's War. And My Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World goes over some similar territory about the fusion of Nazism and Islamism during the war. So I think the religion of Islam can be interpreted in different ways, and it is interpreted in different ways. But in 1940, from the late 30s, in the mid 40s, during the war, and then in the immediate post-war years, the people who became the leaders of the Palestine national movement interpreted Islam. Husseini interpreted Islam as an inherently anti-Jewish religion. So I am avoiding any hint of generalizing about Islam. I'm not doing that.
Sure.
And I think that's a mistake.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
I mean, as a historian of Europe, very few historians of Nazism would say that Christianity had nothing to do with Nazism. We all think it had something to do with it. But Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill thought that Christianity had everything to do with fighting Nazism. Right. So again, you can interpret these things in different ways.
Right. No, very true. Great. That's an excellent answer. Thank you. Another question here from Paul Lips, who says there are claims that Jewish pressure groups influenced some of the American leaders in their attitudes to Zionism. Is that something you found as well?
What strikes me, that's an excellent question. Thank you. What strikes me about 1945, 46, 47, 48 is how little power Jews had in the United States. The Jews were not able to convince Telford Taylor and Robert Jackson in Nuremberg to indict Hashim al-Husseini. They were not able to get the United States to lift its arms embargo. They were not able to prevent the State Department at the United Nations from trying to undo Israel's battlefield victories in the summer of 1948 in various UN Security Council resolutions. So what is striking is the reality that there were 3 million Jews in the United States, something like that at the time. They were a small minority, and while there was sympathy, they did not have a great deal of political power. Did not. Was there sympathy for the Zionist project in American public opinion? Of course there was, but the Holocaust had happened. And this wasn't because the Jews were powerful. It was because many Americans finally, after the war, realized what had happened. And and they remembered who fought with the Allies and who didn't fight with the Allies. So there was, again, I come away from having thought about these years with a deep sense of how little power. If the Jews had had a lot of power, Hashim al-Husseini would have been in a courtroom and forced to answer questions under oath. And there would have been a lot of people who would have been forced to testify about who did what when in 1941 to 45. And that never happened.
Right. Sheldon Lerman asks, he says, given that the Soviet Union saw Israel as part of their anti-West strategy, isn't it ironic that when the Soviets arrested Menachem Begin in 1940, he was charged with being an agent of British imperialism?
It is ironic. I didn't know that, or I'd forgotten it. So thanks for reminding me.
Maybe a sort of follow-up question to that is, it seems that given that, that as well as the Soviet policy on Israel changing for the worse from our perspective in the 50s and onwards, that also prior to prior to the Holocaust, the Soviet Union had a much more anti or ambivalent position towards Zionism, and certainly Zionists within its own borders.
1935 to 39, 1941 to 1949. Those two periods are the exceptions in the norm of the history of the Soviet Union.
Right.
1935-39 is the period of the Popular Front, collective security.
Right.
1941 from the Nazi invasion in June to voting in favor of Israel's admission to the United Nations. 1941, 49. That's an exception. In the norm in the history of the Soviet Union was antagonism to Zionism. That's the norm. And so the turn of 1949 was also it was Stalin's power politics, but it was also the Marxist-Leninist norm.
Yeah.
Zionism is a bourgeois deviation. Class is the primary issue. Religion is a bunch of baloney. And the Jewish nationalism is reactionary. This was typical. This was the norm.
Right. So I think we're out of questions from the audience. I have one more question for you before we finish, and I guess it's this. You've written this book. I hope everyone reads it. It's available. It's called Israel's Moment by Jeffrey Herf. It's available on Amazon and Book Depository and hopefully good bookstores wherever you live. But reading it now in 2022, obviously it's a work of history. It's important, like all works of history are important. You're a historian. I don't need to tell you that. But what does it add to our understanding of Israel today, or the way people talk about Israel today, the debate around Israel today? What's your hope that this book?
I hope that people will understand the Zionist project was a fundamentally liberal project, that it was at one with the spirit of modernity, that it was a project based on rejection and revulsion with imperialism and with racism and ethnocentrism. It was a fundamentally democratic project, and that the forces arrayed against it were reactionary. They were pre-modern. They were some of the leaders were racists and anti-Semites, and that the spirit that the opposition to the state of Israel in the Middle East was not solely a product of Nazism. I'm not saying that. That's much too simple. But that a wartime fusion of Islamism and Nazism was a driving ideological force. And so I would like, especially young people today, to realize this basic liberal project that emerged, that led to the creation of the state of Israel, and to reflect on how reactionary the sentiments were that were arrayed against it. And if we can, politics is a lot about the meaning of words.
Yeah.
And for many decades, people have somehow associated that there is something reactionary about Zionism and something progressive about trying to destroy the Jewish state. And so I guess I would summarize your excellent question by saying it's that redefinition of the meaning of words and recapturing what the words meant in 1947, 48 that I hope the book does.
Thank you so much, Professor Jeffrey Herf. It's a fantastic book. Everyone should get a hold of a copy, educate yourselves, tell your friends to buy it. I think it's the ambition that you just outlined for us for the book, I think is of supreme importance, actually, in terms of the debates around Israel outside of these shores, on university campuses and the pages of the media and elsewhere. And I want to thank you so much for putting the time in and the effort, the research into putting this piece of work together. And as we approach Yom Ha'atzmaut and we think of Israel's independence and what it means to us today, it's worth contemplating just how that moment for Israel has been misremembered and misunderstood and misinterpreted so many years later. So thank you, Jeffrey Herf, very, very much for joining us. I've written my email into the chat. Those of you who are not on my mailing list and would like to be on my mailing list, please email me, paulg@begincentre.org.il, and you'll get all my emails about the events that we have here, both live here at the Begin Centre and also on Zoom, our weekly English discussions on Zoom. For those of you who came late to this talk, I will also be sending out to those of you on my list a link to the recording of this, so you'll hear all of Professor Herf's comments at the beginning that you missed. And I thank everyone. I wish you all a Chag Ha'atzmaut Sameach, a happy Independence Day for the State of Israel and those of us for whom it means so much. Thank you, Professor Jeffrey Herf, very, very much.
Thank you, Paul, very, very much.